So I can see those children crying and weeping and screaming every day because they've done something this foolish. Reality has kicked in. People, please, train up your children. I know they've been trained good, but a lot of times they get influenced by other children or whatever the case may be. This should not be.
Yes, 7 shot and 5 killed, including a 74-year-old grandmother who was the matriarch of her family. For the first time, the family is revealing the motive of this shooting, saying that these 2 teenagers wanted to be together no matter the cost.
2 teenagers are charged with killing 5 members of an East St. Louis family. One will be tried as an adult. The 16-year-old boy is accused of killing the family of his teen girlfriend. Among the charges today, the dismemberment of a body.
Second suspect, a 15-year-old girl, is also looking at first-degree murder charges in the execution of 5 family members and shooting of 2 others.
5 members of the same family lost their lives within just a few hours. But what immediately caught investigators' attention wasn't only the scale of the tragedy, it was the way it unfolded. The first emergency call was only the beginning. Before investigators could fully understand what they were facing, more calls followed from different parts of East St. Louis. With each new scene, it became increasingly clear that these incidents were not isolated. They were connected. The victims all belonged to the same family: a grandmother, her children, and her grandchildren. An entire family forever changed in the span of a single day, leaving a community searching for answers and investigators trying to piece together a timeline that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. What happened inside those crucial hours? Why did the events unfold across multiple locations? And what would investigators discover as they began connecting the pieces of a case that would leave an entire community in shock? To answer those questions, we have to go back to where this story began. Welcome back to Darkness Protocol, where every case is built on verified facts, official records, and careful research. If you appreciate carefully researched true crime documentaries that separate evidence from speculation, be sure to subscribe to Darkness Protocol so you don't miss future investigations. Now let's return to East St. Louis and begin where this investigation truly started.
One of them died and 2 others were hurt, and 1 other person was shot and killed at a home at 39th and Summit.
Before investigators could begin answering difficult questions, they first had to understand who had been affected. Behind the headlines were real people whose lives had been intertwined long before their names appeared in news reports. At the center of the family was 74-year-old Patricia a grandmother whose home represented far more than just an address. Like many family matriarchs, she was a steady presence who helped keep generations connected. Around her were relatives at different stages of life, each with their own responsibilities, routines, and plans for the future. Among them was 49-year-old Cherie, along with 24-year-old Devin May. Also among those who lost their lives were 25-year-old Shania Thompson and 21-year-old Quentin Thompson. Together, they represented 3 generations of the same family, making the tragedy especially difficult for neighbors and the wider East St. Louis community to comprehend. As word spread, the sense of disbelief grew quickly. Residents described the events as unlike anything they had witnessed in their community. Many struggled to understand how so many members of one family could be caught at the center of a single investigation. Public officials sought to reassure the public, explaining that investigators believed this was a targeted incident rather than a threat to the wider community. For those who knew the May and Thompson families, the loss extended far beyond the names released by authorities. It left grieving relatives, close friends, and neighbors trying to come to terms with a tragedy that had touched an entire community. At that stage, investigators knew who the victims were. What they did not yet know was how one family's story had unfolded across multiple locations, or what events had brought them to that point. So how did one family become the focus of such a devastating investigation? The investigation began during the early hours of Sunday, July 13th, when emergency dispatchers received the first report of a serious incident in East St. Louis. At that moment, responding officers had every reason to believe they were dealing with a single crime scene, tragic but isolated. As patrol units arrived, their first priority was to secure the area, identify those involved, and determine whether there was any immediate danger to the public. While that process was still unfolding, another emergency call came in from a different location. At first, there was no clear indication that the two incidents were connected. Separate locations often mean separate investigations, and officers began treating them that way. But as information was exchanged over police radio and investigators compared the details coming in from both scenes, similarities began to emerge. The names of those involved started appearing more than once. Addresses, family connections, and the sequence of events suggested that what officers were responding to was far more complex than anyone had initially believed. As additional investigators were assigned to the case, another location entered the investigation. By then, it had become clear that this was no longer a routine response to a single emergency. Authorities were now coordinating an investigation that stretched across 3 separate locations, each adding another piece to a rapidly evolving timeline. Illinois State Police soon assumed a leading role in the investigation, working alongside local agencies to reconstruct exactly how the events had unfolded. Their task was no longer limited to processing one scene. It was to determine how multiple locations, multiple victims, and one family were connected. But the second location revealed something investigators hadn't expected. The first location investigators examined was a residence near 39th Street and Summit Avenue. Responding officers focused on securing the area and identifying everyone connected to the scene. At that stage, the investigation was still being handled as what appeared to be a single, isolated incident. Detectives began documenting evidence, speaking with witnesses, and working to establish a timeline of the morning's events. But while those efforts were underway, another emergency call redirected part of the investigation. The second location was at the John DeShields Homes, a public housing community commonly known by longtime residents as the Gompers Complex. What officers encountered there immediately changed the direction of the case. The similarities between the two locations were impossible to ignore. Investigators began comparing names, family relationships, and the sequence of events.
Defendant said you are staying locked up pending trial.
That these
we have
scenes
much
were
more.
Connected was no longer just a theory, it was becoming the most likely explanation. As detectives coordinated with dispatchers and investigators at both locations, another report arrived. The third location was Jones Park, only a short distance away. By the time officers reached the park, the investigation had expanded far beyond what anyone had anticipated when the first emergency call came in. Information from all 3 locations was brought together, and detectives began reconstructing the events minute by minute. It was during this process that investigators made a critical discovery. The people involved across all 3 locations belonged to the same extended family. What had initially appeared to be separate incidents was now understood to be one coordinated investigation involving relatives connected through the May and Thompson families. That realization transformed every aspect of the case. Detectives were no longer asking whether the scenes were related. Instead, they were trying to understand how the events unfolded across multiple locations, why one family had become the focus of the investigation, and who might have been responsible. At this point, what do you think investigators were beginning to piece together? With the immediate scene secured, the investigation entered a new phase. Detectives from the Illinois State Police joined local officers to build a single timeline from events that had unfolded across multiple locations. Every detail mattered, from the order in which emergency calls were received to the movement of people between the 3 scenes. Crime scene investigators carefully documented physical evidence at each location, while detectives began speaking with neighbors, relatives, and anyone who might have seen or heard something that morning. Even the smallest observation was recorded. Investigators knew that in a case involving multiple locations, a seemingly insignificant detail could become the piece that connected everything. At the same time, officers worked to identify every victim and notify their next of kin. As those conversations took place, detectives also began interviewing family members who had not been present during the incident. Their goal was to understand the family's recent interactions, establish a clear timeline, and determine whether anything unusual had occurred in the days leading up to that Sunday. Investigators also reviewed available surveillance footage from nearby businesses, residential security systems, and public areas. They examined digital evidence where appropriate and compared witness accounts against the timeline already taking shape. Rather than relying on a single source, detectives looked for details that could be independently confirmed before adding them to the investigation. As more information was verified, one conclusion became increasingly clear. This was not a random series of unrelated events. Illinois State Police publicly stated that the family had been specifically targeted, while also assuring residents there was no ongoing threat to the broader community. Even with that assessment, many critical questions remained unanswered. Detectives still needed to determine who had carried out the attack, how the events unfolded across multiple locations, and what had set the entire chain of events in motion. Then investigators discovered a connection that changed everything. As investigators continued comparing evidence from all three locations, the investigation began pointing toward two individuals. According to Illinois State Police and court records, one was 16-year-old Jaimir Davis. The other was a 15-year-old girl, whose identity has not been publicly released because she is a juvenile. Authorities allege that both teenagers knew members of the family before the incident. Investigators also stated that the two suspects knew one another, making their relationship a central focus of the case. Detectives worked to determine how their interactions with the victims fit into the timeline they had spent hours reconstructing. As the investigation progressed, Illinois State Police announced that both teenagers had been taken into custody. Prosecutors later charged Jaimir Davis, who was being prosecuted as an adult, with 5 counts of first-degree murder, along with additional felony charges connected to the investigation. The 15-year-old female suspect initially appeared in juvenile court, where prosecutors began legal proceedings while seeking to transfer her case to adult court. Investigators emphasized that the arrests were the result of evidence gathered throughout the investigation rather than any single discovery. By comparing witness interviews, physical evidence, and the timeline established across the multiple locations, detectives believed they had identified those responsible. Even with the arrests, authorities remained careful in their public statements. Investigators confirmed that they believed the attack had been targeted, but they released only limited information about the motive while the case remained active. Much of the evidence would ultimately be examined through the court process, where prosecutors would present the allegations and the defense would have the opportunity to respond. For the East St. Louis community, the arrest brought some answers, but they also raised difficult questions. Many people were left trying to understand how two teenagers had come to the center of an investigation involving members of the same family. Do you think investigators acted quickly enough? Or were there warning signs that were missed? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. As investigators continued building their case, one question remained at the center of public attention. Why did this happen? While rumors spread quickly online, authorities urged the public to rely on verified information as the investigation moved through the court system. What investigators confirmed was relatively limited. Illinois State Police stated that the attack was targeted, not random, and that the suspects and victims knew one another. Officials also confirmed that there was no ongoing threat to the wider East St. Louis community. Beyond those facts, investigators deliberately withheld many details while gathering evidence and preparing the case for court. What prosecutors later alleged in charging documents painted a more detailed picture. According to court filings, the incident was preceded by growing tensions involving the 15-year-old female suspect and members of her family. Prosecutors allege that disagreements within the household had intensified in the days leading up to the incident, and that those conflicts became part of the motive presented by the state. These allegations form part of the prosecution's case and will ultimately be evaluated through the judicial process. What remains unknown is equally important. Investigators have not publicly answered every question surrounding the planning, the precise sequence of decisions, or the individual roles alleged by prosecutors. Those details will likely emerge only as evidence is presented in court, and both sides have the opportunity to examine it. For investigators, establishing a motive was never about explaining the tragedy away. It was about understanding the circumstances that prosecutors believe led to one of the most devastating family cases East St. Louis has faced in recent years. As the legal process continues, many of the answers people are searching for will depend not on speculation, but on what can be proven through evidence presented in court. In the days that followed, East St. Louis found itself mourning a loss that reached far beyond a single neighborhood. Residents gathered to remember the lives of Patricia A. May, Cherie L. May, Devin D. May, Shania W. Thompson, and Quentin L. Thompson, while community leaders called for unity and support for the family members left behind. Illinois State Police continued their investigation as the case moved into the judicial system. Officials reminded the public that the legal process would determine the facts presented in court and urged people to avoid speculation while proceedings were ongoing. Prosecutors and defense attorneys would each have the opportunity to present their cases with the evidence ultimately examined before the court. For the surviving relatives, the legal process marked only the beginning of a much longer journey. While court hearings may answer some of the unanswered questions, they cannot undo the loss or erase the impact this tragedy has had on an entire family. Cases like this also leave a lasting impression on the communities where they occur. They serve as a reminder of how quickly lives can change and why careful investigations, credible reporting, and due process remain so important. As this case continues to move through the courts, Darkness Protocol will continue following verified developments and official records as they become available. And as always, we remember the people at the heart of this case, not simply as names in a headline, but as individuals whose lives mattered and whose stories deserve to be told with accuracy, fairness, and respect.